In this video, I really want to talk about the gear ratio of our reels, whether it is a bait caster like the one that you see me holding right here, or maybe even a spinning reel. Because you hear the term gear ratio thrown out there a lot. And at times, honestly, it doesn't really make sense. Like when I've heard people talk about why they use a certain gear ratio, it doesn't make sense what they're saying. And at other times, there's people that don't put enough emphasis on gear ratio. So in this video, I really want to talk all about gear ratio. Now, before we get into it, this video is brought to you by Fin Fishing Apparel. And right now for the month of September 2025, I'm running a package deal over on the website. You can get a USA made sun shirt like this one and a duck hat, which is a waterproof lightweight hat, for $64. So it's basically 30% off the typical retail of that, and it is the best way to help support this channel. So I'm gonna leave some links down below in the description. Thank you to all of you who have shopped at Fin Fishing. I greatly, and my family greatly appreciates it. All right, let's talk a little bit about gear ratio. Now, one thing I wanted to mention real quick before we really get into it is that you should never listen to anyone who talks about gear ratio in relationship to reeling a bass in. And what I mean by that is that when it comes to fighting fish in the ocean, like giant 500,000 pound tunas and fish like that, gear ratio can make a huge difference on getting line in. When you're talking about catching a 2 pound, even 10 pound, or even 15 pound bass, your gear ratio is not gonna matter as far as getting that fish in. So I wanna make sure that people know that. When it comes to bass fishing, there's really nothing about getting the fish in that makes a whole lot of sense. Now, there's a couple of things that gear ratio can really help you to do. And the big thing is that a gear ratio is either gonna make you a very efficient angler or really help you to slow down. So let's talk about those few things. And I want to talk, obviously, the first thing about slowing down. Now, during certain times of the year, it is best to have a slow moving lure. For example, when I'm fishing a spinnerbait in the pre-spawn and I'm wanting to slow roll that bait down, 45-degree angle banks or even creek channel swing banks, that is a good time for me to go with a lower gear ratio reel. Something I don't really go below about 6.1 to 1 anymore. Like that's about the lowest I go. I have used some 5.4 to gear ratio reels. I just don't do that a lot anymore. But if you are a fast twitch guy or you're just hung up a little bit, sometimes going down in gear ratio is going to help you to slow a bait down to really get it to the pace that a bass is going to want it in cold water. Now, something that this does not apply to is baits that you are working with the rod. For example, another bait that I love to use in cold water is a jig. But I am not going to use a slow gear ratio reel with a jig in cold water because it makes no sense. Like I am not using the reel to actually work the bait. I'm using the rod with a jig and then I'm reeling up the slack. So it makes no sense to step down your gear ratio in cold water for baits that you're going to use a rod for. Again though, if it's a spinner bait, if it's a chatterbait, if it's a swim bait, those baits you are using your reel to bring them in for the most part. So stepping down will help that lure to slow down. It can help you to simply slow down. Because obviously you could take a 7.1 to 1 gear ratio or an 8.1 to 1 gear ratio reel and really slow it down, but it just gets to be a little bit harder. And when you go a long time without getting bites, it's just natural for us to start speeding up. So if you do that and you're fishing in cold water where the bass maybe really want a slow presentation, you can miss a lot of fish because you're bringing it too fast. So sometimes having a slow gear ratio reel in those situations where you want a bait to go really slow is key. Now there's another time that might be key, and that's kind of later in the summer. Later in the summer, I've seen bass get on really slow presentations as well. For the most part though, those are ones that I work with my rod. Every now and then it might be a crankbait, where a slow gear ratio reel with a crankbait is a really big deal. But a lot of times, again, if there are baits that I'm working with my rod, I don't want a slow gear ratio. So let's go ahead and actually talk about that. Any bait that you really work with your rod, you can pretty much fish the highest gear ratio reel that you can get away with. So this is a lot of times where I'm going to use an 8.1 to 1 gear ratio reel and above, because what I'm trying to do is pick up the slack with my reel. And if I am fishing, for example, let's talk about flipping and pitching the bank. If you are flipping and pitching the bank and you have an 8.1 to 1 gear ratio reel and your friend is flipping and pitching the bank behind you and he has a 6.1 to 1 gear ratio reel, I believe that that means that you will be able to get your bait in 25% quicker than the other angler, because he is getting in 6 revolutions while you're getting in 8 revolutions for every full revolution of the gear handle. So that's roughly about 25%, which means that bait's coming into you 25% faster if you think about it like that. So if you guys are flipping and pitching over the course of a day, say you did that all day, I don't know exactly what the percentages would be, but you would probably end up getting 10%, maybe more, 15% more flips and pitches than your angler, than the buddy that's in the back of the boat, because you're able to get that line in faster and get that bait back out quicker. So I don't know what the exact percentages are. It's not 25%, because you spend most of the time when you're flipping and pitching with your bait actually in the water and you're working that bait up and down. There's just a short time where you're reeling it, getting that bait in, making the next pitch. But if you have a high gear ratio reel, you will get more pitches over the course of a day. And what it comes down to is if you can just get one extra pitch in comparison to your buddy over the course of a day, that is the likelihood of catching one more bass. And one more bass could be a 10-pounder. It could be whatever is big for the lakes that you fish. So that is why you can be a lot more efficient with those high gear ratio reels. Same thing, for example, and it even magnifies when you're not talking about flipping and pitching, when you go to offshore fishing. Like if you are dragging a worm across the bottom and you drag it through that strike zone, maybe it's a rock pile, maybe it's a brush pile. When you get past that fish, when you get past that brush pile, it might be time to reel that bait back in and make another cast. But you may be a lot further away from that brush pile. Maybe you're 70 feet away from that brush pile. As in comparison to when you're flipping and pitching, you might only be 20 foot or 30 foot away from the target that you're fishing. So when you reel that bait up to make another cast, it can really start to let you get more casts in a day and let you be more efficient. That is the biggest thing when it comes to gear ratio that can help you. Now, one thing that I do want to talk about is something that I heard Ish Monroe talk about a long time ago when it came to gear ratio. And he said that when you are fishing in heavy cover, for example, like if you are frog fishing on a mat or you are flipping and pitching a mat of vegetation, there is too high of a gear ratio. And what I mean by that is if you have there's some reels out there that are 10.1 to 1 gear ratio reels, and there's going to be guys that watch this and they use this with their frog and they have no issues. But I have noticed the exact same thing, because I used to have a reel that was a 10.1 to 1 gear ratio reel. I stopped using it for this exact reason, just when it came to frog fishing. When it comes to the other stuff we just talked about, it could be a really, really great reel. But when you are bringing a frog over a mat and you have a 4, a 5, a 6, 7 pounder eat that bait, and you set the hook on a fish, you typically have your drag locked down when you're fishing a frog. Same thing with flipping and pitching. When you lock into that fish and your drag is not moving, it can be physically difficult to turn your reel handle because of it being a high gear ratio reel. So this comes back to the exact same reason why going through the grass on a bicycle on a high gear ratio is really difficult, where obviously the low gear ratio, it's a lot easier. Same thing when you're dragging a fish, a big fish, through a mat of vegetation and you have a 10.1 to 1 gear ratio reel, it is almost too difficult at times to keep that thing going. Now you can somewhat pump the rod, catch up on the slack, and pump the rod. But a lot of times I've noticed when I look at like video footage, when I set the hook on a fish that's in a mat, I pretty much am just trying to crank that thing in. Now I don't want to go with a low gear ratio, a super low gear ratio reel, because of the exact same thing we talked about earlier about being efficient. Like if I make a 100-foot long cast with a frog across the mat, I'm going to work that bait through the strike zone, and then I might have to reel up 50 or 60 feet to make the next cast. It's not always going to be that exact amount, but I think you know what I'm saying. So there is kind of a nice point there where you kind of had the best of both worlds. To me, that is something in like the mid 7s to 8 range. About 8.1 to 1 gear ratio. That's what I typically go with on a lot of my frog rods. That is what I like. Something in the 7 range would also work. So those things to me are some of the most important things when it comes to choosing a gear ratio. Now, if you just want a good all-around gear ratio reel that you can use, because look, not all of us have the ability to have 10 reels or 20 reels or even 4 reels. Some of us just can have 1 or 2. Go with something in the 7s. 7.1 to 1, 7.3 to 1. That is a good overall gear ratio. You can be slow with it. You can be fast with it. You can do everything that you want with that. So anyways, guys, I think that's all I want to talk about when it comes to gear ratio. Sorry this ended up being a little bit lengthier, but I just wanted to make sure that I was somewhat thorough with it. So hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. Also, don't forget to check out the fin fishing gear. I will leave linked right here. I will see you guys tomorrow.